I am James Surowiecki. I'm the New Yorker's finance columnist. I write a column called The Financial Page. And I am here with three experts. Am I allowed to say that after the last panel? To talk about the next 100 days in the U.S. economy in the broadest sense. And I will begin probably with a look at the present and at the past 100 days. To my far right is Bob Kuttner, who is the founder and co-editor of The American Prospect, former columnist for Business Week, and highly acclaimed commentator on economic affairs generally. In the middle is Doug Holtz-Eakin, who's president of DHE Consulting, LLC. Most of you probably know him because he was the director of domestic and economic policy for John McCain's presidential campaign last year. And before that, he was also the director of the Congressional Budget Office. And to my immediate right is Josh Steiner, who is co-president and a managing principal at Quadrangle, is that right? And was also chief of staff for Lloyd Bentsen when Lloyd Bentsen was Secretary of the Treasury during the Clinton administration. So, well, let's start, as I mentioned, I guess, with the present. So the question I want to kind of toss out broadly speaking to each of you, I guess we'll start with Bob, is where do you think the economy is right now? And the context for that is that in the last, let's say, month or 3 weeks, there has been, it seems as if, a kind of a shift in sentiment at the very least to some extent. You're starting to hear this phrase green shoots more often than before. The stock market is I don't know what it did today, is doing today, but as of yesterday, it was actually up on the year after being down more than 25%. There are some signs that maybe the rate of deceleration is slowing slightly. But where do you think we stand right now, and what are the prospects for us going forward?
Well, I don't think it's bottomed out yet. I don't think we're close to that. I think in some ways it's a false dawn for a variety of reasons. Nothing has really dramatically changed in financial markets. I think the administration's policy is to kick the can down the road and to assume that this is mostly a crisis of confidence. You had an unnamed senior economic official telling David Leonhardt in Times that there is no major bank that is insolvent. I have other unnamed senior officials telling me that at least one and maybe two money center banks are in fact insolvent and are only solvent because they're on life supports from the Fed and the Treasury. So I think the financial markets are desperately looking for signs of optimism. But in terms of toxic assets being underwater, because the mortgages that they are ostensibly backed by are still underwater, nothing fundamental has changed. And in terms of consumer purchasing power really taking a hit, and every respectable economist thinking that unemployment is going to keep going up for the next several months, nothing fundamental has changed. And lastly, the stimulus package is probably too small by a factor of about 3. A good litmus is state and local governments. State and local governments are in the hole over the next 2 years about $450 billion because of declining revenues. They're still laying off workers. They're still suspending projects. They're talking about raising taxes in a recession, which is, of course, perverse. The stimulus makes up about 150 of that, about a third. And people say, well, my God, how can you have a bigger stimulus package? We've got this deficit. We've got this rising debt. I think history's great answer to that is World War II, where we finally got out of the Great Depression by having deficits that were as high as 28, 29% of GDP in 1 year. And of course, all that reinvestment powered the economy into finally a robust recovery, and then we paid down the debt when the economy resumed growth. So I think, to Obama's credit, he's averted a Great Depression. But I think the risk is that we could be in for a great stagnation. And I think the strategy of dealing with the banks' insolvency and the banks being so underwater, by inviting the speculators back to the table, this time with Fed and Treasury financing and guarantees in advance rather than bailouts after the fact, rather than doing it right with a resolution process, like we did with the S&L mess in the 80s, like we did with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in the 30s. I think the risk is a Japan scenario where we avert a Great Depression, but we have prolonged stagnation. And until the administration applies stronger medicine, I think we're at risk of a stagnation scenario.
Are you as optimistic as he is?
And that's optimistic, by the way.
I'm a little more optimistic than Bob. I think there are things we agree on and a couple I disagree on. So from my perspective, there are some things about this situation that are actually not particularly special. So we've had financial crises before of this type. We've had them in the Nordic countries, Japan, the United States. We've had recessions before, 74, 75, 80, 82, very severe recessions. I had hair then, but they were still very bad. And but what's unique about this situation is we came into it with a housing bubble. That's a factor that is different than those other experiences. And we arrived at this point in history with an American household sector that was in unprecedented debt and has since seen its portfolios just take an enormous hit. So it's deeply indebted and lost a lot of net worth. It's going to come out slowly, regardless, I think. That's an important feature of things. And we arrived with a federal government whose budget was, the technical term, fundamentally screwed up. Regardless of what you think of Congresses, and I don't actually like either Congresses, Democratic or Republican, having seen them in action, for most of our country's history, they couldn't get things too badly wrong because they did everything on an annual basis. So if you ran a deficit, you sort of fixed it. But with the rise of long-term spending programs that are fundamentally programmed by demography and long-term projections, we arrived in this situation with the federal government badly in debt and really in trouble. So as we go forward, I think what we're going to see is a couple of key questions. Number one, I'm with Bob. Do we fix the financial crisis in a more effective and strong-arm fashion? What we're doing now looks a lot like Japan. A lot of forbearance that says, yeah, things are really fine. They're not insolvent. We'll change the rules a little bit. I think we need to be much more aggressive on the banks. If we do that, and you start to see the housing market stabilize, and I believe you'll see housing starts bottom in the second quarter and start to show up in the second half of the year, then what I would expect to happen in the economy as a whole is for us to flatten out in the second half of this year and start to grow next year. But we will be faced with a slow path of growth. It'll be sluggish because of the households' need to rebuild their portfolios. And that means we're going to have to build policies that sell abroad and really build business investment. Those are going to be sources of demand that we need. And we don't have the policy architecture right now to support those needs. And we certainly don't have a budget that solves the long-run budget problems. We have the most risky and dangerous budget outlook that you could have. If you look at what the Obama administration put out, they are basically saying that by 2019, we will be borrowing just enough to pay the debt on existing outstanding debt. So we're going to get a new credit card to pay off our old one.
Right.
And that's if everything breaks their way. And I promise you it won't. It doesn't for anyone in Washington. So this, I think, the near term, sluggish. Looking down the road, we have this very high degree of difficulty political maneuver of changing from spending more and taxing less to exactly the opposite. That's going to be hard.
Okay.
Look, I guess I would separate the issues a little bit. Before I do, I want to thank you for having me. I read your column every week, and I think it's great.
Oh,
and the only source of tension in my marriage consistently is my wife and I fighting over the New Yorker each week, so it's nice to be here. Let me say the following. I think it's important to separate the real economy, and by that I mean everything doesn't happen within a 5-mile radius of this building, from what's happening within a 5-mile radius of this building. And let me start with that, which is the financial system. I guess I'm in a slightly different place than Bob, which is the following. If you go back 4 or 5 months, I think most informed observers of what was going on in the financial markets thought there was a meaningful risk of a complete and severe meltdown. Now, when you say meaningful, I don't know if that was 10% or 20%, but I think most informed observers thought there was a chance that the financial system would be paralyzed, that we would have an immediate takeover of all the major financial institutions. That fear, which I think was genuine and I think was well-founded, you can debate about whether it was a 5 or a 20% chance, hasn't disappeared completely, but has seriously declined. So if you ask yourself, are you better off today than you were 4 or 5 months ago, I think the answer has to be you're better off today than you were, because that risk is lower. And that risk was really potentially cataclysmic. And it's not the only indicia that things are better, which is to say, by government policies, whether you like all of them or not, the commercial paper market has opened up. You see certain forms of leverage finance being available to companies again for the first time, really, in 6 or 8 months. So do I think the market potentially has overreacted? Maybe, positively. But generally speaking, if you look at the trends on these things, the stock market generally reacts better in anticipation of a recovery. So it generally leads the recovery by some period of time. I think that's the first point. The second point I would say is while there have been a lot of proponents of more radical solutions, and perhaps two of the panelists here are in favor of them, it's very tempting to forget the unintended consequences of radical change. And while not all the solutions are perfect, and we can argue about whether, in fact, some of the incentives that are being put in place by the administration now are, in fact, the practices we want to encourage, a lot of the alternatives are a lot worse. So you can look at Ireland, what happened with the nationalization of the banks. It basically drove out of business almost all the banks, except for the 6 largest ones, where the deposits were guaranteed and where the liabilities were guaranteed. You have to think very carefully about what consequences you take if you can perform radical surgery on a portion of the economy which is this large. We're going to talk about healthcare maybe in a minute, but it's taken us years to even get to the point we're willing to debate healthcare reform, and yet people are talking about dramatic changes to an even bigger portion, in a sense, of our economy in terms of its importance today. So I would be very careful about that, how quickly you want to do it and what way you want to do it. The last point I would make is I think I do agree with Bob in the sense that there are fewer signs that, in fact, the real economy is coming back as quickly as people would like. And that's, I think, much more important question. And that's going to be a slower process, and they are obviously linked, but they are different issues.
Well, actually, given that you've all touched on it, and that it's on everybody's mind, given that the stress test results are coming out this week, I guess, why don't we actually just talk now about, talk about the question of the banking system and the financial system and what should be done. And the Obama administration has taken a kind of, I would call it a nuanced approach, that it has sort of exercised a certain amount of what you might call regulatory forbearance, in terms of, although it won't say it's quite doing that, but it seems to be doing that rather than maybe coming down hard on the banks. It's also proposed this PPIP, terrible name, to kind of purchase the toxic assets, and it's forcing the government to run these stress tests. And in a sense, it's giving the banks time to earn their way out of trouble potentially. Now, you both alluded to Japan, and one question I've always had about this is, this doesn't actually seem that different from what was done in the United States in the 1980s, when the banks were the big money center banks were all effectively insolvent in 1982-83 because of their loans to Latin American countries, which defaulted. We didn't come in and take them over. We essentially exercised regulatory forbearance. We helped them work out a deal. We guaranteed the debts essentially by setting up the Brady Bond thing, and it worked okay at least. And you could also argue that the same thing was done in 1990 when, again, certainly banks like Citicorp were effectively insolvent. And so why do we think Japan is a realistic outcome here? I mean, if we don't go in and resolve the banks or nationalize them or whatever.
You did not have the degree of securitization and complexity in the 80s. You had commercial banks, big money center banks that had made bad bets. And they were effectively insolvent if you marked those assets to markets. So you brought in some Saudi investors to put in some capital. You did the whole Brady deal that ended up stretching the whole process out for several years.
Right.
At the end of the day, they got maybe 70 cents on the dollar. But you did not have this shadow banking system that added this layer of impenetrable complexity and added leverage at very high multiples that was beyond the understanding of any of the regulators. I mean, if you look at subprime, every aspect of it was unregulated. The liar loans, the financing of the mortgage companies that originated the liar loans, the blessing, the bonds that these loans were packaged into with AAA ratings, and the off-balance sheet entities that bought the stuff. So it's much, much more complex, and the structural damage to the banking system is much worse. And I think if you compare what's being done with Detroit with what's being done with the big money center banks, it's very interesting. In the case of Detroit, the government is saying, okay, we're going to give you some aid, but Mr. Wagoner, you're fired. And we're going to require you to restructure your entire company, slim it down, break it up. Everybody's going to take a hit. Bondholders are going to take a hit. Workers are going to take a hit. Pension funds are going to take a hit. Management's going to take a hit. Then you compare that with Citigroup. The idea of breaking up Citigroup, which an awful lot of responsible people, including some regulators, think is not only a good idea, but is a necessary idea. Quelle horreur. Can't possibly imagine breaking up Citigroup.
But I mean, didn't we effectively did to Bear Stearns, in fact, to a much greater degree, what we did to Chrysler and GM, right? I mean, we basically said to them, you're going to sell yourselves at essentially zero, $2 a share. Your management's all going to be gone. I mean, they have done that. I mean, doesn't the question of, when you talk about the complexity, doesn't that make it less, doesn't that make you more wary of what would happen if the government came in and took it over?
Because in a resolution, it's very interesting. When Geithner and Summers want to
Feel free to jump in, by the way. I'm sorry. Go on.
Well,
no, go ahead.
This won't take long.
No. I didn't want to just be...
When Geithner and Summers want to throw cold water on the idea, they call it nationalization. When they want standby legislation to do it because they know they may well have to do it in 6 months, they call it resolution. It's the same thing. One is an alarmist term, the other isn't. It's what they did with the S&Ls. And it's very simple. The exercise is, how big is the hole? Let's have some honest accounting. We don't trust existing management to give us an honest accounting because it's in their interest to cover up what happened. So let's get new management. Shareholders are wiped out. This is what the FDIC does with medium-sized banks several times a month. And you figure out how big the hole is and who takes a hit. How much of a hit do the bondholders take? How much do the taxpayers put in? It isn't that difficult. What is difficult is these convoluted schemes like PPIP that are trying to divine accurate pricing for stuff that's guaranteed by the Treasury and the Fed, which means to begin with it's not a market price, and putting the Fed's own balance sheet at risk is much, much more dangerous than having government come in and do a straightforward resolution and restructuring.
Okay. Josh?
No, please don't.
Well, I mean, the reason I think this is different than the episodes that you mentioned earlier is the pervasive impact on the economy. I mean, this is an economy that actually was hanging in there pretty well. It had a housing bubble, but outside of the housing sector, the U.S. economy is not badly broken. Instead, the financial system dragged it down into what will be the worst recession since the Great Depression. There's no question about that. So the pace of the recovery and the well-being of average Americans depends on getting the financial system fixed up. And it's not rocket science. It's not new and dangerous. It was done in the United States with the savings and loans. It's done every day with ordinary businesses that go into Chapter 11, reorganize, and in the process, something that's not happening now, the shareholders and the management are disciplined. I mean, Malcolm talked about overconfidence, and I think he's 110% wrong, by the way. But the way you fix overconfidence is those guys lose their jobs and their money.
Right.
That's not happening. And you could set up a situation where you do resolutions that work through it, and the taxpayer will have to put some money in because if you gave the haircut you needed to all the bondholders, there'd be so much collateral damage the economy would suffer. So that's a fact of life. Let's get on with that process and then move forward with healthy banks. And this isn't that complicated.
Josh?
Look, I don't want to be an apologist, certainly not for this zip code. Although I guess this zip code is better than some a little bit north or a little bit south. But look, I think there's a very strong temptation to inflict pain for the sake of inflicting pain. There's also a temptation to seek a speedy recovery and a speedy fix to a very complicated problem. And I think my hesitation is not for the fact that the various stakeholders should be responsible for their actions or that the people who cause these problems shouldn't suffer as a result of their bad decisions. No one can argue those things. The question is, again, I think one of unintended consequences. So you look back at the Lehman Brothers decision, and you can argue about whether it was the right thing to let them fail, which I think is a little bit the response people are talking about now, whether it was the wrong thing to let them people fail. There's no question, however, as an example of the decision to let Lehman fail, what happened, one simple example, which is a lot of money market funds suddenly faced the fact that they were holding a lot of Lehman debt. They broke the buck. You saw a huge flight of capital away from money markets, which is a very important source of financing to real corporations, real companies, which issue commercial paper. And you saw a complete tightening of credit. So when Lehman Brothers failed, but when Lehman Brothers failed,
but this is the point.
I'm saying, let's finish.
It's how it fails.
I understand. I understand that point. But all I'm saying is, you pick a panel of the 10 smartest people okay, when they were thinking about Lehman Brothers and said, walk me through the steps that will lead to a huge flight of capital away from money market and will lead to very well capitalized, seemingly AAA credit, commercial companies like GE not having access to capital, those 10 people wouldn't have come up with it. So you can talk about unwinding very complicated places like Citi, but before you do that, you have to ask yourself, is the risk meaningful? I would argue the risk is a lot larger than people on this panel are suggesting. And therefore, is the solution that's being proposed so terrible? Not sure it is.
So, I mean, I agree there's always risk, but think about what's gone on. There's the Treasury, which has performed really poorly in this effort, and the Fed, which has performed heroically, in my view. What have they done? The Treasury has, well, let's start with the Fed. They stepped in initially in a very reactive and ad hoc fashion. Bear Stearns, AIG, what do we do? And have instead turned to doing the things that the economy needs. It needs a commercial paper market. It needs a securitized lending market. It needs to have mortgage-backed securities. It's creating channels that actually work in the economy. The labels on those channels don't matter. It doesn't matter what firm's in there.
But those are all
the Treasury is all about. The Treasury is all about institutions. From the beginning, it has been about what are we going to do for Bear Stearns? What are we going to do for Lehman? Where are we on AIG? What are we for Citibank? And it should not care about any of these institutions. We don't need any of those labels. We need functioning financial markets, and it should set up systematic, impersonal rules for solvent and insolvent, meritorious of aid, not meritorious of aid.
I agree with that.
And we're not doing that.
Can I just
Sure.
jump in? I would take issue, Josh, with a couple of things. First of all, when Wall Street was creating these instruments, there was no concern about this is too complicated, this is risky. The more complicated, the better, because it was more impenetrable and more money could be made by middlemen. So it's a little bit painful after the fact to hear warnings that government, you better be careful because this is complicated and this is risky. It's nice to hear Wall Street worrying about risk for a change, frankly. And I think, secondly, no one's talking about emulating Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers was an overnight collapse. The difference between that and a resolution or a structured bankruptcy, and a resolution really isn't quite the same as a bankruptcy, is you take several months. You send in auditors. You don't do mathematical stress tests, which are bogus. These are the same kinds of VAR models that were so badly discredited as the thing was going up. You actually send in thousands of auditors. And
I'm with you, Bob. Look,
let me just finish the point.
Yeah.
To see exactly how badly wounded the bank is. And then you do a resolution. That's not the same as the kind of panicky decision that Kuttner and Paulson and Bernanke made in 36 hours that we need to let Lehman go to set an example. It's not the same thing as the shotgun acquisition of Merrill by Bank of America. You do this over time. You do this with some competence.
I think that's all fair. I'll just make 2 quick points. Which one is, if you're worried about the budget, right, and worried about the deficits, take the balance sheets of the 10 major largest banks and add them to the federal balance sheet and ask yourself how you feel about the deficit then and how you feel about the creditworthy of the U.S. government, view of the dollar, et cetera. So you can't just simply transfer balance sheets. Let me finish. You can't just balance them
to the Fed.
To the Fed. Either way, if you're worried about the Fed's assets, okay, the balance sheet has gone up by 2.5 times in the past 18 months. So this is going to increase even more. So if you're worried about the solvency of the Fed, too, ask yourself. The second point, which is that I think everything you said about how the FDIC and other institutions go over and take over financial institutions is well said. And I don't think I wasn't pretending for a second that you are arguing for a Lehman-type solution. I would make one point, however, and again, I really don't want to be sitting up here as the paradigm or the example of a defensiveness about Wall Street. But when you think about the solution, you also have to think about where the problem came from. And there was clearly a regulatory failure, right? A lot of it was driven by the individuals at the banks who did it, and there was a regulatory failure. Why do I say that? Just let me finish the point. All the institutions that are causing this problem, with the exception perhaps of AIG, and they were also regulated, but in a different way, were all at highly regulated institutions. All of them were, right? The problem was that you had regulatory competition, right? You had the FDIC, you had the OCC, you had the OTS, you had bank regulators at the state level, and the banks were doing venue shopping. There was competition among regulators, which is not what you want. So when we're thinking about the solution, we also have to be honest with ourselves about the people who are carrying it out. And just as you make a legitimate point that, in fact, we shouldn't be turning to the people who caused the problem at the banks necessarily to solve those problems. We also have to be honest with ourselves about the regulatory failings and their capacity to fix a problem which they didn't foresee and didn't fix in anticipation of it.
So let me say a little bit about the budget.
Okay.
I think this is a big deal. This is actually my complaint with the Obama administration. This is our biggest problem. It's going to be very expensive. Be honest about that. Some estimates are it's $2 trillion. Don't simultaneously spend $800 billion, more than the Pentagon budget, on a completely ineffective stimulus package and set in motion enormous new spending programs that cannot be paid for. Be honest about
what's
it.
The connection between those two?
They're spending money on things that we either can't afford or aren't very effective, and not being honest about what we're going to have to do with the banks. Budget for your problems. That's the point of budgeting.
Okay.
Well, let me.
I know you want to change the subject.
Okay.
I just want to get 30 seconds more
Okay.
in. There was not a regulatory failure. There was a regulatory corruption, and it was a bipartisan corruption. It was Phil Gramm on behalf of the Republicans and Enron tying the hands of the Commodity Future Trading Commission so that it couldn't regulate derivatives. It was Chuck Schumer and Bob Rubin and Larry Summers on behalf of the Democrats being complicit in the same regulation so that you could have credit default swaps unregulated. It was Schumer and a number of Democrats threatening the SEC that if they got tough about regulating some of this stuff, they would take away the budget. So the regulators are simply a creature of the political process.
But I mean, doesn't the
both parties were captured by Wall Street, and that's still the case.
But doesn't the fact that the housing bubble essentially was global and that these banking problems, in fact, if anything, the banking problems at this point are bigger in Europe and in Great Britain than they are here, suggest that unless you think that it's just the entire globe there was regulatory corruption all over the world, which I guess is possible, it has to be more complex than just then the regulators got corrupted in one way or another, right? I mean, this is a bubble. It's a credit bubble. I mean, bubbles happen in markets, right? I mean, they occur regardless. They seem to occur regardless of how well regulation works.
Well, I disagree. I think London has a more serious case of what we do because it has the same political disease.
Well, what about Germany, though? Let's take Germany.
Well, Germany's not doing so badly. Germany still makes things, and Germany has a culture of having relatively well-regulated banks. And German banks.
But Spain has the biggest housing bubble and arguably the best regulation of banks. I mean, they would say that the Spanish model is actually the model that they're going to apply for the rest of the EU. Unemployment now is 20% in Spain, and the housing bubble is worse than anywhere. Well, there was clearly a credit bubble. I mean, there's inarguably.
Credit bubble.
And so in a country where the regulation's working, they still have the worst housing bubble in Europe.
Yeah, that's true of Spain. You want to get on to
Yeah, what I want to shift gears is, sorry.
It's a credit bubble with one unique feature, and that is the securitization. And
right.
I think you just stop the finger pointing on that. This is a product which has proven defective. The customers no longer like it, and we're suffering a big recall. Recalls are expensive. That's all that's going on.
Okay.
We're actually
so
back to Detroit.
We're actually restarting the engine. We're restarting the engine of securitization.
So we've only got a few minutes left, which I guess I should have known, given how much time I've spent writing about this stuff. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, which you won't be happy with, but let's assume for the sake of argument that the Obama administration continues, relatively speaking, on a similar path to the one it's continuing on with the banks, okay? And let's say that the economy stays in the doldrums. What tools are left for the administration and the Fed to use? I mean, the Fed has already embarked on as you've mentioned, any number of different programs, quantitative easing, et cetera. What's left? What can be done if the green shoots turn out not to be, in fact, turning into saplings? So, go ahead, Doug.
Briefly, I don't think it's going to play that way, precisely because they got themselves in a box with the stress tests. And now they're going to be forced, beginning on Thursday, to reveal a lot of public information about who are really the good banks, meaning solvent, and those which are not. Stress tests aren't perfect, but people are going to start drilling through them, and we're going to see the market go to the good banks, credit will start to flow through the good banks, and they'll have to clean up the bad banks. They haven't figured out a good strategy yet on what to do there, and I think we've given them lots of advice. But because you're not going to just stay frozen, I don't think they're going to have to move to some broad-scale new policy intervention. I think instead they're going to have to clean up those bad banks who are going to be identified by the market and shunned. Everyone else is going to pay off their loans, get away from the government as fast as they can, make some new loans, and we'll see the recovery sort of stagger out of that process.
Okay.
Well, I think do the banking rescue properly so that you get the financial system up and running sooner rather than later. Do the housing rescue properly. We haven't talked about that.
Yeah.
There was supposed to be bankruptcy reform. The Obama administration didn't spend much political capital on that. It was defeated.
So to cram down the...
Yeah.
Right.
This is the heart and soul of the whole mortgage refinance strategy, the idea that you have in your back pocket a weapon that if you don't agree to work out, a bankruptcy judge can do it for you. As a result, most of these underwater mortgages are not going to get refinanced. That's going to keep dragging things down. If you get those two things right, housing and banking, you're going to be in much better shape. And then I think we're going to need another stimulus package.
Stimulus package.
Yep.
Okay, good. Josh?
No, look, I think Bob's point is right. I would just add 1 or 2 points. Look, there's been $11 trillion of household net worth that's been lost in the past 18 months or thereabouts, right? The wealth effect is difficult to understand, and the impact of it is severe. So I think to Bob's point, until we get some stability in the housing market, it's going to be very difficult for the economy coming back. We haven't talked about consumer spending. It's what drove the economy for the past 12 to 15 years. And right now, saving rates are much higher than they've been for the past decade. Why is that? People are paying off the debts, or beginning to pay off the debts that they had. For years, economists have been arguing that the saving rate's too low. We're now in the paradoxical situation where, unfortunately, one of the drags on the economy is people taking the advice of all those economists for years. That dynamic, which is not unusual, which is to say when you actually listen to advice, it turns out not always to be right, is one of the causes of the problem. And we need to get back to a point where people feel comfortable spending. I'd say the last piece of it, which we haven't talked about at all, but is an important part of providing stability, is healthcare reform. That, in fact, if you look at people's anxiety level, their sense of the economy, their willingness to spend, one of the reasons savings rates, I think, are high is people are terrified of losing their jobs. Why is one of the reasons they're terrified of losing their job? They're terrified of losing their health insurance. That kind of reform can actually have a very positive impact on the economy if done right.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes left, so quickly. In dealing with the healthcare issue, let me more broadly. Obama has said, although in practice it may not turn out this way, that he's going to move on many. He's trying to move on many fronts at once, and that the idea is that instead of saying we're going to go slowly, instead you want to try to get as much as you can, and that in fact the pieces all fit together. Is this a smart thing to do? Is he right? Is it a reasonable approach, basically?
Yes.
Okay.
I think he gets a lot of credit on, I mean, I'm willing to complain a lot, but this is the longest 100 days because he had to step into a clear leadership vacuum the day after he was elected. Right. I mean, there was no question about it. And so they have done an extraordinary amount in that time. They've gotten a free pass even more than new administrations do because of the circumstances. And now comes the hard part. They're going to have to do mundane things like pass appropriations bills where the Democratic allies will turn out not to be their friends. And healthcare, cap and trade, education reform, all these big deals that are important are going to get tied up in the reality of Congresses. And I don't think they're going to be able to push on all these fronts successfully. The bandwidth's just not there.
It's just too hard to do it politically.
Too hard.
Okay.
Well, I actually think he does have to move on all fronts. As Josh was saying, health reform is key. Labor law reform, I think, is key. Environmental reform, recapitalizing American industry, using the opportunity of stimulus spending to recapitalize American infrastructure. Roosevelt moved on a lot of fronts at once. And I think everybody wishes Obama well. It's remarkable. His popularity rating is higher now than it was when he took office. It's almost 70%. I think that's why it's so painful for some of us to be in a kind of posture of semi-opposition on the financial piece, where we think he's not quite doing it right. But he's a smart guy, and I think he's listening to a lot of other voices, and I think he will get it right. And it does make sense to move on many fronts, because this is the rare opportunity where there is a crisis, where you can make progress on reforms that have been deferred for 30 years.
I agree with that, and I think that one of the important points is I think his definition of leadership isn't necessarily staying up until 3 o'clock and writing the legislation himself. So you can argue about whether he ceded too much control to Congress or whether he should be doing more himself. But it's very clear to the point that you're making about a leadership vacuum that setting a set of clear priorities and recognizing that the way to get those things enacted is not necessarily by being able to pick every point that he would like to see connected is an important demonstration of why there at least the capacity to get a lot of things done relatively quickly.
Okay. All right, in the last minute, I'm just going to ask you, I'll ask you a totally frivolous question, which, well, it's not frivolous in substance, but it's frivolous in form, which is 100 days from now, will the U.S. economy be growing? Will it actually have stopped shrinking?
I think unemployment will lamentably be about 1 million people higher. I think the banking situation will not be immeasurably different, but I think we can look forward to a turnaround sometime in 2010, and that will make people feel better.
Okay. Doug?
I think we'll see things be very flat and sluggish in the second half. We'll still see unemployment rising,
Right.
no question about that.
Right.
But we will have bottomed, and we will be drifting.
Okay.
I think we will have seen bottom. I probably wouldn't agree necessarily with the drifting. I think there will be signs to letting people feel more optimistic about 2010. And what's clearly lacking, or has been lacking, is a sense of optimism. We're just beginning to see whether that's true or whether it's a false dawn. Assuming it's not a false dawn, I think optimism is self-reinforcing.
All right. Thank you very much.